Now the next step is going to be attaching your frame rails to your board, but there's a few things that we need to prep first. Now the first step is to attach the nose and tail blocks. So this is done by just applying glue to the slot and sliding it over the nose if it's the nose block and the tail if it's the tail block. As far as the alignment, you want the arms of the nose block to be pointing towards the rib, so you may have to angle it down or up depending on the rocker of your particular board. Now on top of that, we also need to remove the sharp corner from the ribs at either end of the board. Now if you're working on a fish, you'll only have to do this at the nose, but on any other board, you'll need to trim both the nose and tail, so the first rib and the last. The way that you want to trim this is to basically knock off that 90-degree edge and have it angled towards the nose block so that your rails don't have a hard 90-degree edge that they have to bend against, and this will reduce the risk of snapping the fragile rails. Now we like to use a sharp knife for this, but you could also use a piece of sandpaper or a file if that's more convenient for you. Now like every other step, it's a good idea to check the fit of your ribs. These have been cut with a looser tolerance, so it shouldn't be an issue, but it is a good idea to just check the fit of some of the rib tabs into the rails to ensure that they do in fact slide over. You'll see that the rails are labelled 1 through to whatever the highest number is, and those labels correspond with the rib numbers. So 1 at the tail, highest number at the nose. Once you've determined that rails will fit over the ribs, you can start by gluing this on. So apply polyurethane to each tab and then use a brush to spread the glue all the way around. So you want to get it on the top and bottom as well as the sides of the tabs so you have good glue contact. Once you have glue applied to every one of the ribs, you can slide the rail on and hold it in place using some masking tape. Once you've got both sides of the rails attached, you can move on to getting the bend radius introduced from the rails into the nose and or tail block. Now, as we're working with solid paulownia, there is going to be a risk of things snapping if we're not careful. So what we need to do is give ourselves the best fighting chance by wetting the rails in the front and the rear, so at the nose and the tail sections, and letting that absorb some water for a good 20 minutes before we try and bend it into the nose blocks. This will soften the fibres and give us a better chance of getting a bend without putting too much stress on the wood fibres. To do this, I recommend using a wet rag that you wrap around the rail and come back throughout the 20-30 minutes and just keep spraying it with water to make sure it is well saturated. Now, another option that you can use here is to add steam to the rails, and this will speed up the wet process. So what you can do here is use a clothesline and the same wet rag and apply heat and force that steam into the wood fibres. Now this will speed up the process and it can make life a little bit easier, but with the steam comes additional risk, so it's up to you if you want to use this method. Once your rails have had at least 20 to 30 minutes soaking in that wet rag, you can move on to actually gluing the rails into the nose blocks by first testing the fit to make sure that it will bend easily. And secondly, if you need to, you may need to trim your rails to create the desired length. Once you have confirmed that the rails will bend into the required radius, you can apply glue to the faces in the nose block as well as the edge of the ribs and bend the rails into place and apply clamps. It's a good idea to do this evenly, so bend both sides at the same time to not introduce any excessive stress on one side of the board or the other. So if you have a friend that can apply some clamps, it's a good time to ask for their help. You'll do this for both ends of the boards unless you're working on a fish, which doesn't require any work at this stage. Now the final step of your frame assembly is going to be the additional bracing, which we'll cover in the next step.